It was a cold winter morning in Washington, D.C., the kind where the air felt sharp enough to slice through certainty. I stood in the waiting room of the federal courthouse, the weight of my new judge's robe settling across my shoulders like a promise I had chased for half a lifetime. Just as I steadied my breath, my phone buzzed. A message from my mother lit the screen. "Sweetheart, we won't make it to your proclamation today. The girls booked us a spa day. You understand, right?" A second buzz followed. "Zoe and Lila, the golden twins, self-care over stress today, enjoy your little ceremony." I stared at the words, feeling that old, familiar crack split quietly through my chest. They chose steam rooms and facial masks over the biggest moment of my career. I typed one word back: understood. They thought I was still the forgettable daughter. They didn't know that after this ceremony, I would sign a sealed federal warrant, one carrying the name of Zoe's beloved husband. One that would drag him into prison and pull their perfect little world down with him. Have you ever been treated like you didn't matter, even on the most important day of your life? Tell me where you're watching from. So, I know I'm not alone. When I put my phone back into my robe pocket that morning, pretending the sting hadn't reached the softest part of me, my mind drifted uninvited back to Indiana, to the house where everything began long before I ever learned the language of courtrooms or the mechanics of justice. People imagine childhood as a soft blur of warmth and safety, but mine was carved sharply along the edges of comparison. My sisters Zoe and Lila were the crown jewels of the Monroe family, the dazzling, sunlit sides of the photograph, the parts my parents framed in silver and displayed on every mantel of our home. They were the type of girls people paused for, bright-eyed, magnetic, impossibly charming in a way that seemed to come to them as naturally as breathing. My parents floated around them like planets fixed in orbit, polishing their achievements as if they were trophies meant to validate our family's worth in the eyes of neighbors. Zoe with her ribboned ponytail and perfect pirouette. Lila with her bubbling laugh and flawless cheer captain smile. They were adored before they had even done anything to earn it. My mother used to say, proudly, "The girls just light up the room," and she wasn't wrong. Rooms did seem to glow around them. They glowed so brightly, in fact, that shadows like me disappeared entirely. I was the opposite of them. Quiet, observant. A girl who preferred reading case studies over attending slumber parties, who asked for library cards instead of hair curlers. My seriousness was treated as a flaw, something that disrupted the Monroe family's glossy image. "Ava is just intense," my mother would say with a stiff smile, as though my existence required an apology. I learned early that in our house, brightness was currency, and I did not possess the right kind. Holidays made the hierarchy even clearer. I remember Christmas mornings when the air smelled of cinnamon rolls and pine needles, and the Golden Sisters erupted from their rooms in matching pajamas, squealing over the mountains of boxes tucked beneath the tree. Each year, they unwrapped princess dresses, sequin jackets, fresh ballet shoes, limited edition makeup kits, and watches engraved with their initials. Our parents filmed every shriek, every twirl, every glittering smile, narrating how lucky they were to have such radiant daughters. When it was my turn, there was no camera pointed at me. One year, I peeled back the paper to reveal a used book, U.S. Constitution for young readers, its spine creased, corners bent, a faint smell of dust rising from the pages. My mother said it was a perfect gift for a girl like you, her tone airy but dismissive, as if even my present needed to reinforce that I was different, that I didn't belong in the same glittering category as the others. I held the book tightly, trying to be grateful. But even then, something inside me curled, small and embarrassed, wondering why even Santa seemed to agree that I should stay in my place. It wasn't just the gifts. It was the way my parents introduced us to the world, as if our identities had been pre-written. "This is Zoe and Lila, our girls." My mother would beam, drawing them forward like precious ornaments. Then came the afterthought, always with a quick breath, always with the smallest hitch in her smile. "Oh, and this is Ava. She's the studious one." A bit intense, people laughed politely. Some said, "Every family needs a smart one." As if intelligence were a consolation prize for not being dazzling. I learned to shrink myself in those moments, to accept invisibility as the tax for existing beside two golden daughters. At family events, I became the one who hovered at the edges, the reliable child who could be tasked with anything. Ava, help set the table. Ava, clean up the plates. Ava, tutor the girls before their exams. Ava, take out the trash while your sisters greet the guests. It never occurred to my parents that I wanted to be seen not just as a helper, but as a daughter too. I remember one summer barbecue, when the girls were asked to perform a cheer routine for the relatives. Everyone gathered around them in a circle, clapping and cheering as Zoe flipped flawlessly and Leela landed in her signature pose. Cameras flashed. My mother wiped a proud tear from her eye. I had been quietly reading on the porch swing, but after the performance, Uncle Rick asked if anyone else had something to show. Before I could speak, my mother waved dismissively and said, "Oh, Ava's more of a behind-the-scenes type. She reads court cases for fun." Everyone laughed lightly, and the topic moved on without a single person asking what I might have wanted to share. Maybe that was the moment I internalized the quiet truth that would follow me for decades. In my family, brilliance only mattered if it was beautiful, and mine wasn't. Even at school, where I finally earned my own identity, my parents managed to dim it. When Lila was crowned homecoming queen, my mother held a reception with cupcakes and balloons. Every aunt, cousin, and neighbor received an invitation. Our Lila is everything a daughter should be. She giggled as she taped the golden tiara to the refrigerator as if it were an icon. A week later, when I won first place at a statewide debate competition, an achievement far rarer than a high school crown, I timidly showed my mother the medal, the one I had worked on for months, the one that kept me awake studying precedents long after the house fell silent. She looked at it, nodded once, and said, "Don't get too political at family events, sweetheart. You know how people talk." She walked away before I could respond. I stood in the hallway holding the medal, realizing she cared more about keeping conversations easy than celebrating the daughter who had fought her way into relevance. That was the first time I whispered the words to myself, "I will never be enough for them." Those words didn't come from anger, not yet. They grew from a slow, aching truth that settled in the hollows of my bones, an understanding that no matter what I achieved, I would always be the third line in my parents' speech, the filler between two stars. As I grew older, I sometimes wondered if my parents loved the idea of their daughters more than they loved their daughters themselves. Zoe and Lila fit perfectly into the image my parents curated: the sparkling family Christmas cards, the choreographed smiles, the illusion of perfection they sold to their church group and neighborhood friends. I didn't fit, so they trimmed me down, edited me out, placed me behind the scenes where no one would notice the uneven edge I represented. By the time I turned 17, I had learned to manage the hurt the way some people learn to breathe quietly, instinctively, without hope that anything might change. But even then, there was a small ember inside me that refused to die, a belief that if I worked hard enough, studied long enough, pushed far enough, maybe, just maybe, I could earn the approval my parents so freely gave Zoe and Lila. That fragile ember flared the day I received the letter from the university. I had been accepted into one of the nation's most competitive pre-law programs, complete with a merit scholarship that covered nearly everything. It felt like the world had finally cracked open in front of me. I remember running into the kitchen, the acceptance letter trembling in my hands, my cheeks flushed, my heart pounding hard enough to drown out my doubts. I expected disbelief, maybe even pride, real pride, the kind I had seen countless times directed at my sisters. Instead, my parents exchanged a look that landed like cold water on my skin. My father folded the letter slowly, set it on the counter as though it were a grocery receipt, and said, "Law school? Washington, D.C.? That's far. Too far." My mother tightened her lips, stirring her tea with the faint annoyance of someone whose plans had been slightly inconvenienced. "The girls need us more than you do, Ava," she said calmly, as if stating a fact. "They're the ones who will carry our family's image. You don't have to run away across the country to prove anything." I felt the kitchen tilt under my feet. "I'm not running away," I whispered. "This is an opportunity I worked for." "Exactly," she replied with a smile far too soft to be kind. "Smart kids like you don't need money or attention. You'll make it on your own." The girls, well, they need more support. They're not like you. I didn't understand what she meant, at least not fully, until a week later, when I overheard her speaking to our neighbor in the driveway. I had just returned from school and paused behind the open front door when I heard her laugh lightly and say, "Ava, she's fine. Smart kids don't need money. We're using her college fund to help Zoe and Lila open their first spa business. It'll be good for the girls. Something to build their future." My breath stopped. For a moment, I genuinely wondered if I had heard wrong, if the wind had distorted her words. But then, she continued, with pride thick in her voice, as though she were describing a noble sacrifice. "They have the look, the charm. They'll run the business beautifully. Ava doesn't need financial help, she'll figure herself out. She always does." I leaned silently against the wall, the edges of the wallpaper scraping my shoulder as my chest tightened. It felt like someone had reached inside me and ripped the floor out by its roots. The college fund, my college fund, the one I had carefully asked about when I was younger, the one they insisted existed somewhere, had never truly been for me. It had been waiting for the twins all along. Like everything else in this family, I remember stepping back from the door, my hands trembling faintly, as the neighbor replied cheerfully, "You're such generous parents." Generous. The word nearly made me laugh if I hadn't been so close to breaking. That evening at dinner, Zoe and Lila giggled over brochures for luxury spa interiors, discussing color palettes and aromatherapy themes, as if they had built their business from their own sweat instead of siphoning it from my future. My father teased them playfully about becoming our little businesswomen, pride swelling in his voice, while my mother placed a hand on each of their shoulders and said, "We invest in what brings this family honor." No one looked at me. No one acknowledged the silence hanging from my chair like a shadow. I sat there breathing slowly, counting the seconds between heartbeats as I felt something inside me shift. Not crumble, shift. A slow, seismic movement that told me the girl they overlooked, dismissed, and used as filler in their story would not survive if she stayed. Later that night, I packed a suitcase in the dark. Not much, a few clothes, 3 worn law books I loved, the debate medal my mother ignored, and the acceptance letter I refused to let anyone diminish. I zipped the bag quietly, listening to the familiar hum of the house, my mother on the phone, bragging about the spa plans. My father laughing at something Zoe said, the Golden sisters talking about branding and aesthetic. Their voices drifted through the halls like a celebration I was never invited to. Before stepping out, I paused at the doorway of my childhood room. For years, I had believed that if I tried harder, worked harder, shined brighter, maybe I could earn a place in the home that had never made room for me. But that night, at 17, I understood something with crystal clarity. I would never be given wings in this house. I would always be the daughter they expected to survive on scraps while they fed the golden ones whole feasts. And so, with nothing but a suitcase, a letter, and a heart that felt both hollow and burning, I walked out of the Monroe home without saying goodbye. The air outside was cold enough to sting, the sky ink dark with a thin crescent moon hanging above the quiet street. I didn't know how I would afford D.C. Didn't know where I would live, didn't know how I would juggle classes, work, and survival. But I knew one thing. I would no longer let the people who clipped my wings pretend they were protecting me. That night marked the second emotional bottom of my life, not because of the financial betrayal alone, but because I finally understood the truth buried beneath every cold smile, every dismissive nod, every minimized achievement. I was never meant to fly in their world. So I left to build my own. And I never looked back. Their voices drifted through the halls like a celebration I was never invited to. Before stepping out, I paused at the doorway of my childhood room. For years, I had believed that if I tried harder, worked harder, shined brighter, maybe I could earn a place in the home that had never made room for me. But that night, at 17, I understood something with crystal clarity. I would never be given wings in this house. I would always be the daughter they expected to survive on scraps while they fed the golden ones whole feasts. And so, with nothing but a suitcase, a letter, and a heart that felt both hollow and burning, I walked out of the Monroe home without saying goodbye. The air outside was cold enough to sting, the sky ink dark with a thin crescent moon hanging above the quiet street. I didn't know how I would afford D. C. Didn't know where I would live, didn't know how I would juggle classes, work, and survival. But I knew one thing: I would no longer let the people who clipped my wings pretend they were protecting me. That night marked the second emotional bottom of my life, not because of the financial betrayal alone, but because I finally understood the truth buried beneath every cold smile, every dismissive nod, every minimized achievement. I was never meant to fly in their world. So I left to build my own. And I never looked back. Becoming a lawyer didn't feel like stepping into a profession, it felt like stepping into the life I had been building in the shadows ever since the first night I fell asleep on a legal aid office couch. After law school, while many of my classmates scattered toward lucrative firms with glass offices and catered lunches, I took a different path. I joined the public defender's office, where the hallways smelled faintly of burnt coffee and hope held together by paper clips. Most lawyers don't stay long in that world. Too little pay, too much suffering, too many stories that claw at your ribs and refuse to let go. But for me, it was oxygen. I wasn't there to polish a resume. I was there because I still remembered the grandmother who had lost her home, the single mother cheated out of her savings, the veteran evicted illegally. I carried them with me into every courtroom, every motion hearing, every long night drafting arguments beside a blinking exit sign. Those early years shaped me more than any classroom or textbook ever could. I learned how to fight with precision, how to negotiate with impossible odds, how to wield the law, not as a scalpel, but as a shield. But the more I defended the poor, the deeper I was pulled toward the disease beneath their suffering. The predators hiding behind contracts, corporations, spreadsheets, and polite smiles. White-collar criminals who devastated lives without ever lifting a weapon. Men who counted on desperation to keep their victims quiet. Organizations that built entire empires on exploiting those who didn't know the law well enough to fight back. So, when the opportunity came to move from public defense into the U.S. Attorney's Office, I stepped into it without hesitation. Becoming an assistant U.S. attorney was a turning point, a shift from reacting to injustice to hunting it down. My division handled white-collar crime, and the files I was handed were thick with corruption, mortgage fraud rings, foreclosure scams, predatory lenders forging signatures, shell companies designed to steal federal housing funds. These cases weren't glamorous. There were no dramatic chases, no televised trials, only spreadsheets layered with deceit, emails coded like riddles, and families crushed beneath systems designed to exploit their vulnerabilities. But this was my battlefield. And I thrived. One of my early cases involved a ring of fraudsters posing as consultants who promised desperate homeowners they could stop foreclosure proceedings for a fee. These criminals preyed on people drowning in debt, charging thousands of dollars and delivering nothing but broken promises and empty bank accounts. The first time I sat across from a victim in the interview room, a father of 3 who had lost the house his children had grown up in, I felt the same fire I'd felt at 17 when I overheard my mother say, "Smart kids don't need money." Abandonment and exploitation wear different masks, but their wounds echo each other. I fought that case with everything in me. Weeks of tracing digital payments, decoding fake leases, unspooling a web of shell companies designed to confuse. When the verdict came guilty on all counts and 22 families had their homes returned or compensated, I walked out of the courtroom into the winter air and breathed deeply for the first time in years. Justice, when it finally arrives, has a weight and a warmth that settles into the bones. Another case involved a fraudulent landlord organization that claimed to manage subsidized housing but owned none of the properties they collected rent for. They exploited immigrant families, elderly tenants, and low-income workers, people who rarely had the resources to fight back. I spent months undercover as a tenant applicant, gathering evidence while watching mothers hand over money they had saved by skipping meals. Taking down that organization was personal. It wasn't about headlines, it was about making sure no one ever had to whisper apologies while being robbed of the roof over their children's heads. The night we arrested the ringleader, a grandmother hugged me so tightly my ribs ached. She whispered, "You heard us when no one else would." Somewhere along the way, the press took notice. A journalist wrote an article calling me the prosecutor who gives a voice to the ignored, a title that followed me for years. It felt surreal, almost foreign. to be recognized for something I had done without expectation of praise. But accolades were never what fueled me. My motivation came from places I rarely spoke about: the loneliness of ignored achievements, the hunger in dim apartments, the memories of being introduced as the intense one, the ache of being unseen in a house that should have been home. Justice became the language I used to rewrite the story of my own invisibility. As my caseload grew, so did my reputation. Judges knew I came prepared. Defense attorneys knew not to underestimate me. Supervisors trusted me with the cases no one else wanted. And then one morning, on a day that felt as ordinary as stale office donuts and overflowing inboxes, I was called into the U.S. Attorney's office. He sat me down, cleared his throat, and said, "We're nominating you for a federal judgeship." The words struck me with the force of a destiny I had never dared articulate aloud. A federal judge. The kind of position people spend decades chasing. The kind of authority I had once only admired from a distance, drifting through courtrooms as an intern with a notebook full of dreams. It was the first time I allowed myself to think, maybe I've climbed high enough to finally see the horizon. When the nomination went public, colleagues congratulated me, professors reached out, former clients sent handwritten notes thanking me for fighting for them, and even a handful of journalists emailed me for quotes. My inbox overflowed with warmth I had never expected. But when I glanced at my phone to see if my parents had texted just once, my screen was blank. Hours passed. Then, finally, a message came from my mother. For a fleeting second, I let myself imagine something different. A message full of pride. A moment of connection. A simple, "We're proud of you, Ava." Something human. Instead, her text read, "Proud of you, sweetie. But can you help promote the girls' spa launch this weekend? They need the visibility." The words struck harder than any insult could have. Even at the peak of my career, even as my nomination to federal judge made national headlines, my value in her eyes still lay in what I could do for Zoe and Lila. My achievement was not a miracle. It was an accessory. Something to be mentioned casually between discussions about eucalyptus facials and aromatherapy branding. In that moment, I finally understood the truth that had been whispering itself beneath my ribs for years. Success does not rewrite the stories people have already decided about you. To my mother, to my father, to the family that once cut my wings and drained my future to fund someone else's dream, I would always be the daughter who needed no applause, no investment, no care. The studious one. A bit intense. But they were wrong about something. I didn't need their recognition anymore. Not now, not ever again. Because the same career they dismissed, the same path they never supported, the same law they believed was a phase for the daughter who wasn't glamorous enough, would soon give me the power to expose everything they had tried to hide. And the first to feel that power would be the golden son-in-law they worshipped like a trophy. They had no idea that I was coming for him. And justice was coming with me. The irony of life is that it rarely delivers its cruelties all at once. Instead, it places them quietly along your path, disguised as ordinary days, waiting for the precise moment when you least expect them. That moment came for me shortly after the nomination committee initiated my background review for the federal judgeship. It was standard procedure, thorough, intrusive, sometimes exhausting. But I welcomed it. I had nothing to hide. My life had been built from scratch, brick by bruised brick, with no shortcuts and no family safety nets. Still, in the background, I continued managing my caseload as an assistant U.S. attorney, one case in particular consuming my nights. A sprawling real estate and money laundering investigation involving a web of LLCs, shell companies, and fraudulent property transfers scattered across the country. At first glance, it looked like yet another ring of housing vultures, those predators who circle vulnerable families, waiting for one late payment or one missed document signature to swoop in and steal their homes. But this case was different. It was larger, more coordinated, almost elegant in its construction. Someone intelligent had built it, someone patient, someone cruel. We had traced at least 200 illegal property seizures, houses belonging to low-income seniors, disabled veterans, single mothers fighting foreclosure, and immigrant families who barely spoke English, let alone understood the contracts forced under their noses. Signatures had been forged, Mortgages had been refinanced without consent. Deeds had been transferred into LLCs named so vaguely, Sunrise Holdings, Northern View Enterprises, that they could have belonged to anyone. But all roads led back to a single conglomerate. And behind that conglomerate, we were certain, stood one man. For weeks, we combed through financial trails, cross-referenced signatures, subpoenaed bank records, interviewed victims who had lost everything, and still apologized to us as though poverty were a crime. Then one evening, near midnight, when the office was nearly empty and the only light was the pale glow from my computer screen, a pattern emerged. A set of recurring initials, a digital signature hidden behind a proxy, a transfer link that had been scrubbed but not quite erased. When the final piece clicked into place, it didn't feel like victory, it felt like impact. The breath knocked out of me, the room shrinking. My hand frozen over the keyboard. Because the name at the center of the operation, the mastermind behind the 200 stolen homes, the millions laundered through real estate, the shell companies that strangled entire neighborhoods, was Ethan Blake. My sister Zoe's husband. The golden son-in-law my parents worshipped like a lottery ticket. I leaned back in my chair, numbness spreading through my chest like frost. Ethan, the man whose face appeared in every family photo my mother sent out on Christmas cards. Ethan, whose ring Zoe flaunted with the energy of someone displaying a national treasure. Ethan, who my father once said was the type of man who will elevate our whole family. I stared at the screen until the letters blurred. A prosecutor learns to compartmentalize, to separate personal emotion from objective analysis. But this wasn't a standard case anymore. This was the man my parents compared me to constantly, the man whose brilliance they praised more in a single dinner than they had ever acknowledged my entire existence. I forced myself to keep reading. The deeper I went, the darker it became. Ethan hadn't built this empire alone. He had used Zoe and Lila's spa chain as a laundering front, funneling dirty money through inflated invoices, fake vendor accounts, luxury wellness retreats that never occurred. Each spa essentially served as a washing machine, spinning criminal funds until they came out warm and clean. Financial statements were forged. Equipment purchases were faked. Payroll expenses were manipulated. The spas had never been profitable, something my parents refused to acknowledge, always attributing the lack of revenue to slow seasons and future potential. But what destroyed me wasn't just the fraud. It was discovering that my parents were involved. Their names appeared on multiple mortgages, assets used as collateral for loans tied directly to Ethan's shell companies. Not passive signatures, but active participation. They had knowingly co-signed documents, received profit shares, attended meetings that were clearly not about legitimate wellness services. They had risked and, in some cases, gambled away their own financial stability because Ethan had promised them a stake in something big, something that would secure the Monroe legacy. My pulse pounded as I read through the victims' statements again. Elderly homeowners scammed out of their deeds. A retired Marine who lost his house after signing what he believed was a temporary refinancing form. A grandmother living on disability who trusted a consultant sent by one of Ethan's companies. Families who had nothing, absolutely nothing, yet still found themselves squeezed dry by a man who already had more than he deserved. These were the same kinds of people I had fought for my entire career, people I recognized, people whose stories had shaped my purpose. And now I realized the monster who had devastated them sat beside my parents at Thanksgiving dinners, toasted champagne at family weddings, stood in my childhood home, smiling as though he had earned the right to take up space in it. My throat tightened. Not just with anger, but with something deeper, betrayal layered on betrayal, old wounds ripped open so forcefully they felt new again. All my life, I had fought to protect the vulnerable from predators. What I never imagined was that one day I'd be staring at evidence proving those predators were tied to my own bloodline. My parents had betrayed me many times. But betraying the very people I had dedicated my life to defending, that was something else entirely. Something unforgivable. I closed the files, sat still, and let the truth settle like ash in my lungs. My family had become everything I had sworn to stand against. Exploiters. Manipulators. Accomplices in the destruction of innocent lives. For a moment, my vision blurred and I had to grip the edge of the desk to steady myself. I felt 17 again, standing behind a doorway, hearing my mother say, "Smart kids don't need money," as she handed my future to Zoe and Lila. But this was worse. This wasn't just theft of opportunity. This was theft of livelihoods, of homes, of dignity. They weren't just indifferent, they were complicit. That night, long after the building emptied and the cleaners had finished their rounds, I sat in my office with only the hum of the desk lamp and the soft tapping of snow against the window. I thought of the victims, their trembling voices, their hesitant smiles, the way they held their own hands as though trying to keep their bones from falling apart. They were the reason I became a lawyer. The reason I had eaten ramen dry in dark rooms. The reason I slept on stained couches, worked impossible hours, and pushed myself toward a bench where justice was no longer a theory but a command. And now, somehow, they were tied to my family's greed. For the first time in years, doubt crept in, not about the case, but about myself. Could I be impartial? Could I be ruthless enough? Could I sever the last string binding me to a family that had never loved me properly but had still shaped the contours of my life? The answer came slowly, rising from the quietest part of me. Yes, I could. Because justice didn't care about last names or shared childhoods. And neither did I, not anymore. The man who had destroyed so many lives was married to my sister, and I was the one who would take him down. In the aftermath of discovering Ethan's crimes and my parents' quiet complicity, I found myself walking through Washington, D.C., with a heaviness in my chest that no title, no nomination, no courtroom victory could dissolve. The truth had carved a hollow in me, not of weakness but of clarity. And clarity demands space. Not escape, not retreat, space. A place to transform hurt into purpose, betrayal into structure, and justice into something people could walk into and touch with their hands. That was how the House of Justice was born. While others celebrated promotions with vacations, properties, or luxury cars, I spent nearly every evening wandering through old districts near the federal courthouse until one cold afternoon. I found it, a 3-story brick building with cracked windows and ivy choking its gutters and a "for action" sign peeling at its edges. It was beautiful to me instantly. A structure forgotten by the city, ignored by developers, overlooked by passers-by, much like the people I had fought for all my life. I bought it quietly, using the savings scraped from years of government paychecks and pro bono stipends. No one knew, not my colleagues, not my friends, certainly not my family. It was mine, entirely mine, untouched by Monroe fingerprints or Golden Sister expectations. Renovating the building became my version of breathing. I transformed the entire first floor into a public legal aid center with wide windows so no one would ever feel hidden or small when seeking help. We stocked it with pamphlets written in plain English, no Latin, no legal labyrinth, just simple knowledge placed directly into the hands of the people who needed it. The walls were lined with photographs of families whose homes we had saved from foreclosure fraud, a widow smiling in front of her newly returned house, an elderly couple holding the keys they thought they'd lost forever, a mother lifting her child as if lifting her future. Each image reminded me why law mattered, why I mattered. The second floor became the Housing Crisis Clinic, a space dedicated to fighting the very crimes Ethan had perfected: predatory lenders, forged deeds, scam landlords, illegal evictions. I set up long oak tables where volunteers and lawyers could sit beside clients rather than across from them. No hierarchy. No cold institutional distance. I wanted the room to feel like solidarity, not bureaucracy. I hung on the walls dozens of letters written in careful handwriting, notes from elderly veterans thanking us for helping them keep their houses, messages from single mothers who had found safety again, postcards from families who had rebuilt their lives. One letter in particular always stopped me in my tracks. A retired Marine had written, "Thank you for seeing me," when everyone else said it was too late. Some days I would stand in front of that letter until my throat tightened, because I knew exactly what it felt like to be unseen until someone chose to look. The third floor became a community meeting hall, warm, spacious, lined with wood reclaimed from demolished row homes. I installed a long table down the center, far wider than anything I had grown up sitting beside, with enough chairs for anyone who wished to be heard. The room shimmered with purpose, the faint scent of cedar drifting from the polished beams above. Here, Neighborhood groups met to discuss housing rights, veterans gathered for legal workshops, immigrant families attended clinics on tenant protections. It was a house built not of wealth, but of will, a place shaped from the fragments of my past that had refused to break me. Every detail in the building carried my fingerprints. Not the Monroe image, not Zoe and Lila's glossy branding. Mine. I chose every frame, every book on the shelves, every lamp casting a soft glow on wooden floors that once held only dust. I filled an entire wall with books, not academic tomes, but accessible guides explaining the law in language anyone could understand. Knowledge is a form of armor. I wrote on a small brass plaque beneath the shelves. No one takes your home when you know your rights. I knew no time's problem. Some nights, long after volunteers had left and the lights of the federal courthouse glowed across the street, I walked the empty halls alone. My heels echoed against the restored brick, and I felt a steadiness I hadn't known since childhood. This wasn't a trophy. It wasn't a monument to success. It was a sanctuary built from everything I had survived. If Isabel had her ranch in Aspen, a symbol of a life carved from abandonment, then this building was mine. My refuge. My rebellion. My declaration that justice was not an idea but a home, and I had built it with my own hands. And like the ranch, I kept it hidden from my family. They would never step inside these walls. They would never claim its glory or distort its purpose. They would never drape their golden son-in-law's shadow across its floors. This house, its mission, its victories, this was the one thing they could not taint, diminish, or steal. The House of Justice was the first place I had ever belonged without apology. The first place where every corner whispered back a truth I had waited a lifetime to hear. You were never the forgotten daughter. You were becoming exactly who you were meant to be. And soon, this house would be the birthplace of the warrant that would dismantle everything my family thought was untouchable. The morning of my swearing-in felt unreal, as though I were walking inside a memory I had once imagined but never allowed myself to fully believe. The marble steps of the federal courthouse were dusted with winter frost, glowing faintly beneath the pale Washington light. My breath came out in slow clouds, steady and controlled, but my heart beat with the sharp ache of a life that had been lived clawing upward, always upward toward a place no one thought I belonged. Inside the courthouse, attendants moved quietly, adjusting microphones, straightening programs, preparing for the ceremony of a new federal judge. My name was printed on every folded pamphlet, embossed in gold foil. Ava Monroe, Judge of the United States District Court. There were rows of chairs reserved for guests, but none bore the names of my parents. There was no Monroe family sign, no flowers delivered with congratulations, no murmured excitement from the people who were supposed to be proudest of me. The empty seats did not sting as I expected. Instead, they felt like a truth laid bare, one I had lived with so long that silence had become its own kind of acceptance. They had chosen to be absent. I had chosen to rise anyway. And because I refused to let absence define the moment, I filled the room with those whom the world had once overlooked. The families I had fought for, the neighbors who had stood with me during late-night case reviews, the colleagues from legal aid who had watched me sleep on office couches and still insisted I belonged in every courtroom I entered. At the front row sat the elderly couple whose home had been saved after a forged deed nearly stripped it from them. The wife held a bouquet of winter lilies wrapped in brown paper. Next to them was a single mother who had spent 4 months in eviction court before we dismantled the scam landlord who preyed on her. Behind them were 2 young boys who had drawn pictures of Judge Ava in crayon and insisted on wearing their best sweaters to witness the ceremony. Then, just before the doors closed, a man I recognized stepped quietly inside, a retired Marine I had once represented, the same one who had written the letter I hung on the wall of the House of Justice. He walked down the aisle slowly, stiffly, carrying a foil-wrapped container in both hands. When he reached me, he whispered, "I baked something. It's not much, but it's from the heart." His voice cracked. Mine nearly did too. He took his seat, shoulders straight, pride radiating from him like a steady flame. And for the first time on a milestone day, I felt surrounded not by blood, but by belonging. When the ceremony began, the courtroom lights dimmed slightly, and the clerk stepped forward to announce my name. Applause rose before I even reached the podium, a soft swell, then a thunderous wave that washed over me. I stood with my right hand raised, the judge's robe falling in clean lines along my arms, the oath echoing through my chest. With every word, I thought of the people who had once been dismissed, ignored, silenced, and of the young girl I had once been. Sitting on the edge of the kids' table, with no one noticing, she had dreams large enough to swallow the sky. As the final words of the oath left my lips, the room erupted into applause again, this time louder, warmer, deeper. It was the sound of recognition, of respect, of arrival. Then, in the middle of the celebration, my phone buzzed. A notification from Instagram flashed across the screen. I didn't want to look, not today, yet I did. A video from Zoe. The Golden Sisters lounged in white robes at a luxury spa, champagne glasses raised, faces slathered with masks. The caption read, "Relaxing while our little sis plays judge today, self-care first." Lila added a sticker of a cartoon gavel hitting a pillow. For a moment, the old familiar ache stirred, the ache of being the afterthought, the unnecessary child. But then I looked up at the Marine, at the elderly couple, at the single mother gripping her daughter's hand, and I felt the truth settle inside me with unshakable certainty. I am not alone anymore. After the ceremony ended, and photographs were taken, and congratulatory handshakes exchanged, I invited everyone, every client, every colleague, every volunteer across the street. Not to a fancy restaurant, not to a banquet hall, but to the home I had built from the ashes of my past, the House of Justice. The building glowed with warm yellow light against the winter dusk, its brick walls sturdy like the backbone I had forged through years of standing alone. When I unlocked the door and pushed it open, heat rushed out to greet us, carrying the scent of mulled cider and cinnamon. I had arranged a quiet reception there, not grand, not extravagant, but intimate and full of meaning. A local community baker donated pastries. A group of volunteers brought trays of hot soup. The Marine set his homemade biscuits on the main table, mumbling an apology that they were a bit burnt, though they disappeared within minutes. People wandered through the building slowly, reverently, as though exploring a museum of victories stitched together by invisible scars. On the first floor, they paused in front of the photographs of families whose homes had been saved, images glowing in warm frames. Some guests cried. Others touched the pictures gently, as though trying to bless them. On the second floor, they read letters pinned neatly along the wall. A few veterans recognized names of friends and wiped their eyes quietly. Children traced their fingers along the bookshelves filled with simplified law guides, whispering to one another as if they had stumbled upon magic. But it was the third floor that held the heart of the evening. There, in the community hall, I had created a mini gallery curated from drawings made by children whose families had once lost their homes. Crayon houses with bright red roofs. Stick figure families holding hands. Suns drawn too large for the paper, glowing with impossible joy. These drawings were my reminder, my anchor, that justice wasn't a profession, it was a promise. One I had kept, again and again, even when no one had kept theirs for me. As people filled the room, laughter rising and weaving through the cedar-scented air, someone touched my arm. It was the elderly woman whose home I had once fought tooth and nail to defend. She looked around the hall, eyes shining, then whispered, "You built this? You built all of this? Just to help people?" I nodded. She took my hands in hers, fragile, warm, trembling. "My dear," she said, her voice breaking, "this is what family looks like." The words struck deep. Deeper than she could ever know. Because she was right. This building, built from a lifetime of being overlooked, was now full of people who saw me, celebrated me, chose me. They weren't bound to me by blood. They were bound to me by gratitude, respect, and shared struggle. Around me, children ran with frosting-stained smiles. Volunteers clinked paper cups, veterans told stories near the windows. And the House of Justice pulsed with a warmth I had never once felt in the Monroe household. As the evening stretched on, I stepped aside for a moment, standing near the balcony door, looking out into the snowy street below. Across the horizon, the courthouse lights shimmered faintly through the falling flakes. My phone buzzed again, another spa selfie from the Golden Sisters. I turned the phone face down on the table. Because in that moment, surrounded by the laughter of people whose lives had touched mine, I understood something powerful, something freeing. My family had not abandoned me. I had simply outgrown them. Tonight, I was exactly where I was meant to be, standing in a home I built, held up by people who believed in me, celebrated by those who had once survived, because I refused to let the law forget them. They chose a spa day. I chose justice. And justice, in every form, chose me back. When the last guest left the House of Justice and the lights dimmed to a soft amber glow, I stood alone in the community hall for a long moment, letting the warmth of the day settle into my bones. The applause from the ceremony still echoed faintly in my chest, mixing with the laughter and gratitude that had filled these rooms. For a few sacred hours, I had felt held, seen, celebrated by the people who mattered. But justice rarely grants long pauses, and mine summoned me sooner than expected. My phone buzzed an internal notification from the clerk's office. Urgent, sealed matter, assigned to your chambers per protocol. Immediate review required. By the time I walked across the snowy street and entered the courthouse again, the building was nearly empty, its hallways lit only by sparse security lamps. I rode the elevator up to my chambers, the heavy robe brushing against my ankles like a reminder. I had chosen this path, and tonight, the path was choosing me back. When I unlocked the door to my office, the sight waiting for me drew the breath from my lungs. My desk, usually organized with fastidious precision, was covered in towering stacks of documents. Manila folders, flash drives, IRS reports, HUD affidavits, FBI financial tracing logs, mortgage fraud summaries, a thick envelope stamped with Seal Federal Property, Crimes Division. And on top of everything, a single file, clipped with a crimson tab, motion to approve sealed warrant, emergency authorization needed. My pulse thudded softly in my ears. This wasn't unusual. Newly sworn judges often handled overflow emergency matters when conflict barred another judge from ruling, but something in the air felt charged, heavy, almost prophetic. I pulled my chair back, sat down slowly, and opened the red-tabbed file. The first name on the indictment list stared up at me like a blade pressed to skin. Ethan Blake. I froze. The room seemed to tilt, the words blurring before snapping back into agonizing clarity. My breath thinned. I forced myself to read further. Primary charges: conspiracy to commit mortgage fraud, money laundering, wire fraud, fraudulent transfer of property, elder exploitation. Co-conspirators: financial benefit, asset entanglement, Zoe Monroe Blake, Lila Monroe, Margaret and Daniel Monroe, my parents. A cold sensation crawled across my spine. My hands tightened on the folder until the paper crinkled beneath my fingers. This wasn't just an arrest warrant. This was an avalanche poised to crash not only onto Ethan, not only onto the criminal enterprise he masterminded, but onto the entire Monroe facade, ripping apart every illusion my family had built around wealth, prestige, and golden children. I scanned the cover sheet again. Judge Haroldson, unable to preside due to personal conflict, subject of investigation is his nephew's business partner. Per emergency protocol, case reassigned to Judge Ava Monroe. Immediate review required. The irony was almost cosmic. This warrant had come to me not through fate, but through the rigid, unyielding gears of judicial protocol. The system had not selected me because of my history or my wounds. It had selected me because I was next in line, because I was trusted to uphold the law without bending, without trembling. My chest tightened as I flipped through the pages. The evidence was overwhelming. Ethan had orchestrated a network of shell LLCs, siphoned millions from illegal property seizures, falsified signatures, laundered funds through spa, business expenses, and used my parents' assets as collateral for expansion loans. Zoe and Lila weren't masterminds, but they had signed documents, opened accounts, lied to investigators about profits. My parents had accepted financial gifts from Ethan, money directly tied to stolen homes. In the eyes of the law, this was conspiracy at minimum, aiding and abetting at most. I swallowed hard. My family was at the center of a criminal storm, and the storm was now in my hands. The ethical conflict struck sharply. For a fleeting moment, a voice, small, shaking, Old rose inside me. Recuse yourself. Pass it on. Protect them just this once. It was the echo of a daughter who still carried, somewhere in her scar tissue, the remnants of loyalty to a family who had never deserved it. Another voice followed, harder, colder. If you recuse, someone else will sign the warrant eventually. Ethan will be arrested. But your parents and sisters. They might negotiate blame, frame the narrative, escape accountability. My fingers trembled as I turned another page. Victim statements, elderly homeowners sobbing as they recounted losing everything. Disabled veterans forced into shelters. Single mothers tricked into signing away rights they barely understood. And the faces of these victims overlapped perfectly with the very people who had celebrated my swearing-in hours earlier. These weren't strangers. They were the heart of the House of Justice. They were the reason I became a lawyer. The reason I rebuilt my life from ashes. And my family had harmed them. I closed my eyes. Suddenly, I was 17 again, listening through a cracked door as my mother said, "Ava doesn't need her college fund. She'll be fine. Smart kids don't need help. It's for different shows, another dumb in." I was 10 again, watching Zoe and Lila unwrap princess dresses while I held a secondhand Constitution book. I was 21 again, eating ramen on the floor of a legal aid office, wondering why my family hadn't called. I was 30 again, receiving a text from my mother asking me to promote the girls' spa instead of congratulating me on a federal nomination. All the abandonment in the world could not compare with the betrayal before me now. The law is a blade cold, sharp, impartial. And I had sworn, only hours ago, to wield it without fear or favor. My hand steadied. My breath leveled. My decision crystallized. With absolute clarity, I picked up the pen. I signed the sealed arrest warrant for Ethan Blake, authorizing the FBI and U.S. Marshals to take him into custody within 24 hours. Then I signed the asset freeze order. Every account tied to Ethan. Every collateral property under my parents' names. Every spa business holding Zoe and Lila benefited from. Frozen. Immediately. I signed the order authorizing federal seizure of all documents, digital devices, and financial records from the Monroe household. The ink flowed like law incarnate. A single stroke for every victim. A single signature for every life shattered by greed. When I placed the pen down, the air in my chambers shifted as though the building itself exhaled. I leaned back, eyes burning, throat tight but unbreakable. There was no triumph in the act. No satisfaction. Only justice, clean, cold, and final. Tonight, I had become the judge the world needed me to be. And tomorrow, the world would learn what that meant for the Monroe family. Morning arrived not with sunlight, but with chaos. My phone buzzed violently on the nightstand, rattling against the wood like it was trying to escape. I reached for it slowly, my eyes still heavy from the long night of reviewing orders and sealing warrants. The screen lit up and the world tilted. 28 missed calls. 43 text messages. And every single one came from the same 4 people: my mother, my father, Zoe, and Lila. The notifications kept flashing, each more frantic than the last. How could you? Fix this now. The FBI raided Ethan's office. We will lose the house. Do something. Ava, answer us. What did you sign? My stomach didn't twist. My hands didn't shake. Instead, a strange, quiet settled inside me. A clarity, a steadiness. For the first time, their panic felt small, unsurprising, predictable, and utterly powerless. I dressed, walked through the light snowfall, and unlocked the door to the House of Justice. Inside, a few early volunteers and 2 retired veterans were already setting out coffee for the morning clinic. When they saw my expression, they paused. "Everything all right, Judge Monroe?" one of them asked, gently. I didn't answer immediately. Instead, I walked to the long community table, made of reclaimed wood, placed my phone flat on the surface, and hit speaker. If my family wanted rage, if they wanted drama, if they wanted to turn my integrity into an emotional hostage, then they could do it in the presence of the very people they had harmed through Ethan's crimes. The call connected instantly. A voice exploded out of the phone like shrapnel. "Ava Monroe, what have you done?" "My mother." screaming so loudly the veterans winced. You put your own family in danger. The FBI froze our accounts. We can't pay the mortgage, the utilities, nothing. Do you understand that? Do you even care? Before I could respond, my mother continued, voice shrill and trembling with entitlement. And Ethan! You put Ethan in jail. He is the best thing that ever happened to this family. He was going to make us wealthy. You destroyed everything we built. I inhaled slowly. When I spoke, my voice came out calm, measured, judicial. Mom. Ethan stole homes. He laundered millions in dirty money. He preyed on vulnerable people. Hundreds of families were hurt. Telev, Dunsuging. My mother shot back instantly, dripping with disbelief. And that's the best thing you can say? You sound just like those poor people who blame everyone but themselves. There was a collective stiffness in the room. The retired Marine's jaw tensed. One of the young volunteers looked physically ill. My mother had just insulted the very people I had dedicated my life to protecting, and she didn't even realize it. Then my father's voice thundered into the call. We built that spa chain together. All of it. Zoe, Lila, your mother, we invested everything. You ruined us. Do you understand that? You ruined us. I felt more tired than angry. You ruined yourselves, I said quietly. By choosing greed. By signing documents you didn't understand. By ignoring every red flag because Ethan made you feel important. My father scoffed, furious. Don't lecture us. You're supposed to help your family, not burn it to the ground. I glanced around the House of Justice. At the photos of families whose homes had been saved. At the thank you letters pinned carefully to the walls. At the veterans who had shown up early simply to offer their hands. At the mother and son waiting quietly for their appointment in the back. This was my family. The people who had believed in me long before my parents ever did, if they ever did at all. Then a voice rose behind me, gentle, firm, carrying decades of wisdom and a moral spine carved from iron. My mentor, Judge Marlene Hayes, had stepped into the room. She placed a hand on my shoulder, leaned toward the speaker, and spoke clearly. Daniel, Margaret, your downfall was not Ava's doing. It was your own. You placed your faith in a criminal. You ignored the law. You dismissed the suffering of real people. Ava did not betray you. You betrayed your daughter long before this. Silence crackled on the other end. Then Zoe's hysterical sobs burst through. Ava, please. Just unfreeze the accounts. We have payments. We have a brand. We have employees depending on us. You had employees, I corrected softly. You had a brand built on laundered money. And you had warning signs you chose to ignore. Leela's voice came next, sharp as glass. So that's it? You're choosing strangers over your own blood? The Marine standing near the doorway stepped forward. His voice shook with controlled rage as he spoke loud enough for the phone to catch it. We're not strangers. We are the people your precious Ethan stole from. Another quiet. A guilty one, a damning one. My parents didn't apologize. Didn't acknowledge him. Didn't even acknowledge the victims listening on speaker. Their world had never included those people. And maybe it never would. My mother's voice returned, trembling with manipulation. Sweetheart, you don't have to do this. You don't have to let them take everything. Just fix it. For us, please. There it was. The mask dropping. Not love. Not remorse. Need. Dependency. The only time they reached for me was when something was falling apart. Mom, I said softly, I'm no longer the shadow in this family. I'm not the quiet one you can overlook. I'm not the daughter you push aside so the golden sisters can shine. My voice hardened. I am a federal judge. And I will not apologize for protecting the people Ethan harmed. Ava. My father snarled. But I was done. I pressed the red button. The call disconnected. The silence that followed was vast, cleansing, almost holy. Judge Hayes squeezed my shoulder gently. You did the right thing, Ava. I nodded because for the first time in my life, I truly knew that was true. I turned back to the room, to the people who had become my family, and said quietly, justice isn't supposed to protect the powerful. It's supposed to defend the people the powerful stepped on. And for once, I wasn't saying it as a lawyer. I was saying it as a judge. The months that followed the warrant, the arrest, and the freezing of assets unfolded with the slow, grinding certainty of a machine finally set in motion. Justice, once invoked, moves at its own pace, sometimes merciful, sometimes merciless, but always deliberate. And for the first time in my life, I stood not at the edges of a story, not in the shadow of a family portrait where I had never quite fit, but at the center of a system that demanded truth, accountability, and courage. And truth, once aired, reshapes everything. Ethan Blake went to trial 8 months after his arrest. The government's case was airtight: every forged deed, every illegal transfer, every laundering mechanism through the spa chain, every exploitative contract. The victims testified bravely, some shaking, some crying, some holding onto memories of homes long lost. Ethan sat stiffly throughout, jaw clenched, as though the world were beneath him and everyone in the courtroom owed him deference. But not even his arrogance could shield him. The jury deliberated for less than 6 hours. Guilty on all counts. He was sentenced to 17 years in federal prison, his appeal denied. Wealth, charm, family, prestige. None of it mattered anymore. My sisters fared differently, but not by much. Their spa chain, already financially rotting beneath the surface, collapsed under federal scrutiny. Investigators traced laundered funds, fraudulent invoices, inflated accounts, and complicit signatures directly back to Zoe and Lila. They weren't charged with masterminding the scheme, but they were held accountable for benefiting from it and lying during the investigation. They avoided prison only by cooperating, but lost almost everything else. Bankruptcy, civil suits, public shame. No brand deals, no glossy sponsorships, no more selfies from luxury spas. For 2 women raised to believe beauty and charm could bend reality, the consequences hit like a winter storm. My parents lost the house. The mortgages they had signed to appear successful were deemed illegal collateral tied to criminal funds. The federal government seized the property immediately. One morning, they woke up with nothing, no savings, no assets, no glory. They moved into a small apartment on the outskirts of Indianapolis, far from the golf courses and charity galas they once lived for. Their fall from grace was not loud, it was quiet, almost invisible, as though the world had simply stopped looking their way. And perhaps that was the truest punishment of all. For a family obsessed with image, losing the audience was worse than losing the wealth. The perfect family they once advertised collapsed. And what remained was the truth they had always hidden. While the Monroe name faded from public admiration, the House of Justice grew into something far larger than I ever dreamed. What had started as a single building with creaking floors and 3 renovated levels blossomed into a nonprofit legal organization funded by grants, donations, and thousands of handwritten $5 checks from people who believed in the mission. Law schools began sending students to intern under our roof. They studied case files at the same oak tables where veterans and single mothers once sought help. They learned not just the law, but the humanity required to wield it. They shadowed me during hearings, attended our weekend workshops, and organized pop-up legal clinics in underserved neighborhoods. Local families mailed letters with updates, photos of repaired homes, new gardens planted where foreclosure notices once hung, drawings from children who now had a place to sleep again. Each envelope reminded me of the truth I had carved from decades of being overlooked. You do not need your family's pride to build a life worth living. The House of Justice became more than an office. It became a movement. My new family. My legacy. And with each passing month, the shadow of the Monroes faded further from my life. It took nearly a year before my parents finally asked to meet. Not to apologize, at least not at first, but to beg. They waited for me outside the courthouse, looking smaller than I remembered, winter jackets pulled tight as though the coldness of their new life had seeped into their bones. "Ava," my mother said, voice cracking. "You have power. Connections. You can help us recover." My father added, "You can help your family rise again." Family. They used the word like a shield, a plea, a currency. I studied their faces etched with stress, stripped of the entitlement they once wielded like a sword. There was fear there too, Not of law enforcement anymore, but of irrelevance. Of losing the daughters they had built their identity around. Of realizing too late that the foundation of their lives had been constructed on fraud and favoritism. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't cry. I didn't tremble. I simply said the truth. I'm not pulling anyone up by pushing innocent people down. My mother flinched, as though the words cut deeper than she expected. I continued, evenly, softly, unshakably. Justice is the same whether the guilty are strangers or blood. You helped Ethan hurt people who didn't have anything. People who trusted you. People I dedicated my life to defending. They looked away. Neither denied it, neither apologized. I took one step backward, not in fear, but in boundary. When the day comes that you apologize to the families whose homes were stolen, then we can talk. And I walked away. Not in anger, but in peace. Because closure isn't always forgiveness. Sometimes it's simply understanding that you don't owe people access to the parts of you they tried to destroy. Months later, during a community livestream, someone asked me the question I had avoided for years. Do you regret cutting ties with your family? I let the silence breathe for a moment. Then, I looked straight into the camera, into the eyes of thousands watching, and said, on the day of my swearing in, a spa day mattered more to my parents than standing beside me. But that moment didn't define my worth, it revealed theirs. I took a breath, letting my voice soften into honesty. If your family doesn't see you, stop shrinking yourself just to fit their vision. Build your own table. Build a place where you don't need permission to exist. Where you're welcomed, not tolerated. Where your worth isn't debated, but recognized. And remember this, sometimes, you are the last person standing between justice and the people who would burn it down. Even when justice requires you to start with your own blood. I leaned closer to the camera. You are not the shadow they told you you were. You are who you decide to become. And for the first time since childhood, I felt fully free.